In a world of lies and deception, one man unravels a twisted truth that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Join me as we dive into the mind of a detective who discovers the shocking truth about himself in the strange case of Heidi Firkus. You won't believe how it all ends. Stay with me till the final reveal. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt. Streetlights flickered, their faint glow casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Detective Marcus leaned against the cold brick wall, his breath shallow, his mind racing. A single drop of sweat slid down his temple, mixing with the drizzle on his face. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the note, the ink smudged but legible. "Come alone. Midnight. 304 Pine." The words were simple, yet they clawed at his chest like a feral beast. He checked his watch, 11:58. The silence of the street was broken only by the distant hum of passing cars. The building loomed before him, dark and foreboding, its windows gaping like empty sockets. Marcus tightened his grip on the pistol at his side. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, its hinges protesting loudly. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and memories of abandonment. Each step echoed, a hollow reminder of his solitude. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, faint but sharp. Blood? A faint rustling upstairs snapped him out of his trance. He climbed the stairs slowly, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, each step an announcement of his approach. At the top of the stairs, a single bulb swung lazily, casting eerie, shifting shadows. The door to the room was ajar, the dim light inside spilling out like a secret. Marcus pushed it open with the barrel of his gun. The room was empty. Almost. In the center sat a chair, its wood worn and splintered, with a single envelope resting on it. He approached cautiously, his senses sharp, every hair on his neck standing on end. The envelope bore his name, his own handwriting. His pulse quickened as he opened it, the paper crinkling loudly in the oppressive silence. "Do you remember?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His vision blurred as fragmented memories clawed their way to the surface. The sound of a scream, a flash of silver, the weight of a lifeless body. He staggered, gripping the chair for support. The pieces fit together with chilling clarity. He wasn't chasing a killer. He was running from himself. The room seemed to close in around him. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. Marcus stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. The thud of his body hitting the ground echoed like a gunshot. His mind reeled, the memories rushing back in fragments. He saw her face, Heidi Firkus, the fear in her eyes, the sound of her voice, trembling, pleading. And then, the sharp crack of a struggle, the glint of the knife in his hand. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. He clawed at his temples, as if trying to scrub the images from his brain. But they wouldn't go away. The room felt alive now, its walls pulsing with a sickening rhythm. The faint metallic scent grew stronger, more vivid. He glanced down at his hands. They were clean, but he could feel the phantom stickiness of blood, warm and accusing. The envelope lay open on the chair, mocking him. He snatched it up, desperate for answers. Beneath the first note was a photograph. It was her, Heidi. But it wasn't from the night she died. It was from before. She was laughing, sunlight catching in her hair. And next to her, him. Marcus dropped the photo as if it burned. He didn't remember this. Couldn't remember this. His mind raced, grasping at fragments of truth, but they slipped through his fingers like sand. He turned, his eyes scanning the room for something, anything, that could ground him. A mirror hung crooked on the far wall, its surface cracked and tarnished. He stepped toward it, drawn by a terrible need to confront what he feared most. The reflection stared back, fractured and distorted. His face was pale, drawn tight with panic. But behind his eyes he saw something else. A flicker of recognition. Of intent. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Slow. Deliberate. They echoed from the hallway outside, growing louder with each step. Marcus froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But his holster was empty. He turned toward the door, every nerve in his body screaming. The footsteps stopped just outside the room. And then, a voice low, calm, and chillingly familiar. "Do you see it now, Marcus?" He couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The door creaked open, but there was no one there. Just darkness. And in the darkness, a single sound. The faint, rhythmic dripping of water. No, not water. Blood. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent. Marcus turned toward the noise, his breath hitching with every step. In the far corner of the room, shadows clung to the walls like cobwebs. He moved closer, each step like dragging his feet through quicksand. The smell hit him first. Coppery, thick, and unmistakable. It churned his stomach, making bile rise in his throat. The shadows gave way to the source, a pool of dark liquid spreading across the floor. It gleamed under the faint light, the red almost black in the gloom. And then he saw her. Heidi. She lay crumpled, her body unnaturally twisted. Her lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling, wide and unblinking. Her lips were parted, frozen mid-scream. Marcus fell to his knees, his pulse roaring in his ears. "No," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The memory surged again, unbidden and brutal. The fight. Her hands clawing at his jacket, desperate. The knife. His hand. Her scream cutting through the night like shattered glass. He pressed his palms against his temples, squeezing his eyes shut. But it didn't help. It never helped. The blood seeped toward him, inching closer, staining the floorboards with silent accusation. He wanted to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The room seemed alive now, pulsing with every beat of his heart. And then he heard it. A whisper. Faint. Chilling. "You did this." He whipped around, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. But no one was there. Just the stillness. Just her body. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps as he backed away. But the whisper followed him, growing louder, more insistent. "You did this." The mirror caught his eye again. It reflected him, but not just him. In the cracked surface, he saw another figure standing behind him. A shadow. Its face was his, but its eyes burned with something dark, something cold. He spun around, his heart thundering, but the room was empty. Still, the whispers persisted, wrapping around him like a vice. "You planned this. You wanted this. You were always the killer." Marcus stumbled toward the door, his hands shaking. He needed to get out, away from the room, away from her. But as he reached the hallway, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. And in the sudden darkness, the voice spoke again. This time it was no whisper. It was a roar. "Face it, Marcus. You can't escape yourself." The darkness was suffocating. Marcus clawed at the door, his fingers scraping against the wood. It wouldn't budge. The air around him felt alive, heavy and pressing against his chest. "Let me out," he shouted, his voice breaking. But the room swallowed his cries, echoing them back in distorted tones. Behind him, the whispers returned. This time, they overlapped, a chaotic murmur of voices. "You lied. You hid. You killed." He spun around, desperate to find the source. The shadows shifted, dancing along the walls like living things. In the center of the room, where Heidi's body had been, the blood pooled wider, darker. And then it began to move. Slowly, impossibly, it crept upward, forming shapes, twisting into something grotesque. The shape took form, a figure, tall and faceless, yet somehow familiar. Its head tilted toward him, a silent acknowledgement that made his stomach churn.
Who are you?
Marcus demanded, though his voice quivered. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an arm, pointing at him with a long, jagged finger. The voices grew louder, each one accusing, screaming, overlapping until they became unbearable. Marcus pressed his hands over his ears, dropping to his knees.
Stop.
Stop it, he shouted, his own voice drowned in the cacophony. The figure stepped closer. The floor creaked under its weight, though it moved like smoke. And then, it stopped inches from him. Marcus felt its presence, cold and unyielding, seeping into his skin like ice water. It leaned down, close enough that he could feel the void where its face should have been. And it spoke.
You?
One word, but it echoed endlessly in his mind. He gasped for air, his chest tightening as memories flooded in with unbearable force. Every detail of that night played out in vivid, agonizing clarity. Her scream, the look in her eyes as the blade struck. His own hands, shaking, covered in blood. He hadn't stumbled upon a murder. He had planned it, executed it, and buried it deep within himself. The figure straightened, its form dissolving into the shadows. But the whispers lingered, now quieter, like a taunting lullaby. You can't run. You can't hide. You are the killer. The door creaked open suddenly, its hinges groaning in protest. A cold breeze swept through the room, carrying the faint scent of decay. Marcus staggered to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. He glanced at the doorway, then back at the room. The blood. The figure. Heidi's body. All of it was gone. But the guilt remained, heavy and unrelenting. The hallway stretched before him, dark and endless. He took a step forward, knowing there was no escape from what he'd just uncovered. Not from the truth. Not from himself. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, dimly lit by a flickering bulb overhead. Marcus's footsteps echoed unnaturally, each one growing louder, sharper, as if the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. His breathing was shallow, ragged. The walls felt closer with every step, pressing inward like a collapsing tunnel. The whispers hadn't stopped. They clung to him, a low chorus of voices just beneath his conscious thoughts. Accusing. Taunting. You did this. You've always been this. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, though it's seeming to shift like it was alive. And then a sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from behind him. He froze, his pulse hammering in his throat. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. He turned slowly, his body trembling. The hallway behind him was empty, stretching into darkness. But the sound continued, closer now, as if it were right beside him.
Tap, tap, tap.
Who's there? He shouted, his voice cracking. The only response was the tapping, now circling him, echoing through the air. A cold gust of wind brushed past his face, carrying the faint scent of iron and damp earth. He felt a presence behind him, heavy and oppressive. Too afraid to turn, he clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Face it, a voice whispered in his ear, low and guttural. He spun around, but again, there was nothing. The hallway ahead beckoned, the faint glow of light at its end promising escape. He stumbled forward, his legs weak but driven by instinct. As he moved, the whispers grew louder, the voices now distinct and overlapping. Heidi's voice stood out among them. You can't run, Marcus. Her tone was calm, haunting, a strange mix of sorrow and accusation. You've already made your choice. No, he muttered, shaking his head. This isn't real. This isn't. His words caught in his throat as he reached the end of the hallway. A door stood before him, its surface old and splintered. Carved into the wood were the words, "The truth awaits." His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, the metal icy under his touch. He hesitated, every fiber of his being screaming to turn back. But there was nowhere else to go. He pushed the door open. The room beyond was identical to the one he'd just left. Same cracked mirror, same creaking floorboards, and in the center, the chair. But now he was sitting in it. The other him. His doppelganger looked up, its face smeared with blood, its eyes dark and hollow. It grinned, a twisted, unnatural expression that sent a shiver down his spine. "You've come so far," it said, its voice an echo of his own. "Do you see it now?" Markus backed away, his heart racing, his mind screaming for answers he didn't want. "You can't escape what you are," the figure continued, rising from the chair. "You're the killer. You've always been the killer." Markus felt the walls closing in, the room spinning, the weight of the truth crushing him. And in that moment, he realized the final, horrifying truth. There was no escape. Not from this room. Not from the guilt. Not from himself. The room seemed to pulse with life, each beat in sync with Markus's racing heart. The doppelganger took a step forward, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if gliding rather than walking. Markus stumbled backward, his back pressing against the cold wall. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, a mockery of curiosity. "Aren't I?" it said, its grin widening. The blood on its face seemed to glisten under the dim light, as if freshly spilled. "You remember everything now, don't you? The planning, the precision, the satisfaction." "No," Markus shouted, his voice cracking as he shook his head violently. "That's not me. I didn't want this." The doppelganger laughed, the sound hollow and chilling, reverberating through the room. "Lies, Markus. You're full of them. You wore the mask so well. Even you believed it." It took another step closer, the floorboards groaning under its weight. Markus's breath hitched as the figure raised a hand, palm up, revealing a blood-stained knife. The same knife. His knife. "You held this," it said, its tone soft but venomous. "You felt the weight of it, the power of it. Do you remember how it felt? When you let it sink in?" The image surged into Markus's mind. Unbidden. Relentless. The blade in his hand. The resistance as it pierced flesh. The warmth of blood spilling over his fingers. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, gasping for air. "Stop," he begged, his voice broken. "Please, just stop." The doppelganger knelt in front of him, its voice now a whisper, almost tender. "You can't escape this, Markus. This is who you are. It always has been." Tears streamed down his face as he looked into the figure's dark, empty eyes. They reflected nothing but the abyss. And in that abyss, he saw himself. The mask of the detective. The orchestrator of the crime. The murderer. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against his skin. "Accept it," it hissed. And then, with deliberate precision, it pressed the knife into Markus's hand. The metal was cold, its weight familiar. He stared at it, trembling, as if the blade carried all the guilt he had tried so hard to bury. The whispers in the room grew louder, surrounding him, suffocating him. "Do it," they chanted over and over. "Do it." Markus's grip tightened on the knife, his knuckles white. He looked up at the doppelganger, its grin stretching impossibly wide, its eyes burning with a cruel satisfaction. His heart thundered in his chest as the figure spoke one final time. "There's only one way out, Markus." And in that moment, Markus knew exactly what it meant. He raised the knife, his vision blurring as the room seemed to collapse around him. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo. And then, silence. The silence was crushing. Markus sat motionless, the knife trembling in his hand. The whispers had vanished, leaving only the hollow sound of his own breathing. The room was still now, eerily so, as if time itself had paused. He stared at the blade, its edge catching the faint, flickering light. For a moment, the weight of it felt unbearable. But the silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. The doppelganger still crouched before him, its grin unchanged, its empty eyes locked onto his. "Why are you hesitating?" it asked, its voice dripping with mockery. "You've already made every choice that matters." Marcus's mind reeled, his thoughts a tangled storm of denial and guilt. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he murmured, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." The figure laughed, low and guttural, a sound that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Supposed to?" It leaned in closer, its voice sharp and cutting. "You wanted it to happen. You planned every moment, every detail. And when the time came, you didn't hesitate." Marcus shook his head violently, the tears spilling freely now. "No, that's not true. I was trying to stop it." The doppelganger's grin widened, impossibly so, its mouth stretching into something inhuman. "Stop lying to yourself," it spat. "You can't undo it. You can't rewrite it. This is your truth, Marcus. It always will be." The walls seemed to press inward, the shadows thickening around him. The knife in his hand felt like it was burning now, the heat spreading up his arm, searing into his chest. He tried to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't obey. It was as if the blade had become part of him, fused to his very being. The figure stood, looming over him, its presence consuming the room. "You know what you have to do," it said, its voice resonating like thunder. "Finish it." Marcus's breathing quickened, his chest heaving as he fought against the weight of the command. The knife in his hand trembled violently, the blade catching the light in flashes that seemed almost alive. And then he saw her.
Heidi.
She stood in the corner, her figure pale and ethereal, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Why, Marcus?" she whispered, her voice soft but devastating. "Why did you do it?" He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Only a strangled gasp. Her gaze pierced him, more cutting than the blade in his hand. "I trusted you," she said, her voice trembling with grief. "You were supposed to protect me." The knife felt heavier, its tip dipping toward the floor as his strength waned. He fell to his knees, his body shaking, his vision blurring. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words barely audible. The doppelganger stepped aside, allowing Heidi's figure to come closer. She knelt before him, her ghostly hand reaching out to touch his face. It was cold, so cold it burned. "You can't take it back," she said, her tone both mournful and resolute. "But you can end it." Her fingers brushed against the knife, guiding it upward. Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of everything crushing him, pulling him under. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, filling the void within him. "End it," they chanted. "End it." And as the blade hovered, trembling, the room seemed to dissolve around him, fading into an endless void. Time stopped. All that remained was Marcus, the knife, and the truth. The void swallowed him whole. Marcus floated in the emptiness, untethered, weightless. The knife remained in his hand, though he couldn't see it. He could feel its sharp edge against his palm, a constant reminder of its presence. Around him, the whispers continued, softer now, more like a haunting lullaby. "You can't escape. You can't hide. This is where it ends." A faint light appeared in the distance, flickering like a dying star. Marcus turned toward it, drawn by something primal, something he couldn't name. As he moved closer, the light grew stronger, illuminating shapes in the void. At first they were faint outlines, blurred and shifting. Then they sharpened, becoming clearer, more defined. It was the house. The same broken-down walls. The same cracked mirror. And in the center, the chair. He stood now in the same room, though it felt impossibly vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there, slumped forward, its hands dangling limply over its knees. Marcus approached cautiously, each step echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The figure didn't move, its head bowed, obscured by shadows. He stopped a few feet away, his chest tightening as dread crept up his spine. The knife in his hand felt impossibly heavy. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. He took another step, the shadows peeling back like curtains. The figure's face came into view, pale and lifeless. It was him. His own face stared back at him, eyes dull, skin waxy. The body in the chair was his. "No," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. This isn't real." The doppelganger's voice echoed from behind him, low and mocking. "Isn't it?" Marcus spun around, but the figure wasn't there. Only the endless void. He turned back to the chair, but now the room was different. The walls were no longer decayed but pristine, freshly painted. The mirror reflected a tidy space, untouched by time or violence. It was the house as it had been before that night. Before everything went wrong. Heidi appeared, standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes locked onto his. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying an unbearable weight. "You can't change what happened." Tears streamed down his face as he dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing endlessly. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to, I didn't." She stepped closer, her gaze never wavering. "You made a choice," she said, her tone firm yet filled with sorrow. "And now you have to make another." Marcus fell to his knees, his hands trembling, his heart pounding like a drum. "What choice?" he asked, his voice desperate, pleading. She knelt before him, her presence cold and unyielding. "To face what you've done," she said, her voice a whisper. "To accept it. Or to let it consume you." The void seemed to ripple, the walls around them shifting and cracking. Marcus looked at her, his vision blurred by tears. "I don't know how," he said, his voice barely audible. She placed a hand on his chest, her touch freezing yet grounding. "You start by letting go." The whispers rose again, but this time, they were different. Not accusations, not taunts, just a single phrase, over and over, soft and unrelenting. "Let go." Marcus closed his eyes, the weight in his chest loosening, the darkness around him dissolving into light. And for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years. Relief. Fresh, like rain on warm earth. The grass beneath his feet swayed gently in the breeze, each blade dancing in harmony with the wind. It was peaceful, serene. A far cry from the suffocating shadows he'd just left behind. He looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of this new place. The vastness of it was overwhelming, but there was no fear, no unease. He felt lighter, as if the weight of the past had been lifted from him, piece by piece. He could breathe again. In the distance, a figure stood, silhouetted against the fading light. At first, Marcus wasn't sure if it was real, or if it was yet another illusion. But as he moved closer, the figure became clearer. It was Heidi. She stood there, just beyond arm's reach, her expression soft, but still tinged with sorrow. For a moment, Marcus froze. The guilt, the shame, everything rushed back. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something else. Forgiveness. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, the wind carried her voice, clear and gentle. "You've been through so much," she said, her tone light, free of anger. Marcus swallowed hard, the lump in his throat unbearable. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, Marcus felt the weight of his own apology sink in. "I know you are," she replied, her voice echoing like a memory he wasn't sure he had. She reached out, her hand extended, her fingers trembling but steady. Marcus took it, his hand shaking, but no longer filled with fear or regret. He felt warmth in her touch, a sense of peace that washed over him like a cleansing wave. "This isn't the end," she said quietly, the words carrying a weight that was both heavy and comforting. He nodded, not needing to ask what she meant. The air around them shimmered, and Marcus realized he wasn't alone in this vast field. Heidi was with him, but so was the truth. The long, twisted road he'd walked had come to an end, but there was no more running, no more hiding. He had finally faced it all, the darkness, the lies, the guilt. And now there was only acceptance. In the stillness of the moment, everything felt whole. There was no need to escape, no need for anything more. He let go. The field around Marcus seemed endless, but he didn't feel lost. The soft twilight light bathed everything in a golden glow, as though the sun itself had forgiven him. He stood beside Heidi, her presence no longer a haunting memory, but something real, something peaceful. He reached out to touch her hand, and this time, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. "Will you ever forgive me?" he asked, his voice low, filled with the weight of years spent running from himself. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held something else, something warm, something human. "I already have," she whispered, her words as gentle as the breeze that danced through the field. His chest tightened, the realization flooding him like a dam breaking. He had spent so long trapped in his own mind, torturing himself, unable to see beyond the walls he'd built. But now, standing here with her, the guilt didn't crush him anymore. It was still there, but it no longer defined him. It was a part of him, yes, but not all of him. He looked around at the vast field, the horizon stretching out in all directions. This was a place of peace, a place where the past could no longer follow him. The whispers had stopped, and the suffocating weight of his own thoughts had lifted. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. "I'm free," Marcus whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for Heidi or for himself. For the first time, the darkness that had consumed him no longer had a hold. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling, like waking up from a long, painful dream. Heidi smiled at him, the expression full of understanding, and her presence wrapped around him like a protective shield. The sky above deepened into a soft purple, stars beginning to appear, twinkling like distant promises. "I'm ready," he said, feeling a sense of finality settle over him. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He had faced the truth, and that truth had set him free. The night deepened, and the stars shimmered like 1,000 tiny hopes scattered across the sky. Marcus stood beside Heidi, the weight of the world now lifted from his shoulders. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so light, so at peace. There was no more running, no more hiding. In this quiet place, the past had lost its power. It was no longer an enemy chasing him, but a lesson he had learned. And with that lesson came freedom. Heidi's presence beside him felt like a soft reassurance, a silent promise that he wasn't alone in this. Her hand rested gently in his, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. He let it be. He let himself be. He let himself be. In the distance, the horizon stretched far and wide, an open expanse filled with possibilities he had once been too afraid to imagine. Now, he didn't need to worry about the future. He only needed to be present in this moment, where the air was fresh and the world seemed to breathe with him. Everything that had led him here, the darkness, the lies, the blood, seemed so distant now. The truth had finally caught up to him, but instead of drowning in it, he had embraced it. And that had made all the difference. Heidi's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "You're free now, Marcus." Her words were not a judgment, but a gift. And as they stood there, surrounded by the gentle rhythm of the world, Marcus realized that he had forgiven himself. The ghosts of the past no longer had a hold on him. He had done what he could, faced what he had to, and now he was simply here, alive, free, and whole. And as the light of the stars bathed them in its quiet glow, Marcus finally felt at home. The story of guilt, betrayal, and murder had come to an end. But now, a new chapter awaited, one that wasn't defined by the past, but by the future he was ready to face. The weight of everything he had carried for so long had finally fallen away, leaving only the endless sky above. And with that, Marcus let go of everything. And in that letting go, he found peace.